The peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union, the world's largest nuclear state, was heralded by world leaders and commentators alike as a miracle. In reality, though, the collapse of the USSR was anything but peaceful. Many of the conflicts that broke out in the aftermath of the collapse are well known: Transnistria, Abkhazia, and Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. But perhaps no conflict does more to dispel the myth of the peaceful Soviet collapse than the Tajik Civil War. This conflict, which saw as many as 150,000 deaths and 1.5 million people displaced, is usually simply overlooked as one of the more violent struggles for power that erupted in the aftermath of the Soviet collapse. I'm your host David, and today we are going to explore Tajikistan's place in the USSR and how Soviet rule sowed the seeds of division that left the state on the brink of civil war in the spring of 1992. This is the Cold War. So, the territory that is today recognized as the Republic of Tajikistan first came under communist rule when it was incorporated into the Turkestan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic by the Bolsheviks in Tashkent on April 30th, 1918. When the Uzbek SSR was then created in 1924, Tajikistan existed as part of the Uzbek Republic as the Tajik Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, or Tajik ASSR. It took until December 5, 1929 for the Tajik ASSR to gain full republic status, at which time it became a constituent republic of the Soviet Union in its own right. These various territorial and nominal changes, of course, reflect a reality that we have explored in previous videos on Soviet Central Asia, namely that the borders of the 5 Central Asian titular republics were somewhat arbitrarily created by Joseph Stalin. Indeed, before the Soviets arrived, states like Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, or Uzbekistan didn't really exist, and little thought was given to the actual ethnic and linguistic boundaries that existed on the ground. But going into the 1930s, Tajikistan did exist, and it existed as part of the Soviet Union. As outlined in several previous videos on the topic, the Soviets' immediate ambitions in Central Asia concerned creating a reliable pool of local cadres, propelling industrialization, and fostering a sense of national identity among the rural communities who now lived in a state where they were all to be Tajiks. And the Soviets certainly had their work cut out for them in Tajikistan. The overwhelming majority identified themselves by their clan or region rather than any nationality, and as many as 80% of southern Tajikistan's population still lived in isolated mountain settlements in the late 1920s. The mostly Pamiri communities who lived in the harsh environment of the Gorno-Badakhshan region to the east were more isolated still. However, the redrawing of Tajikistan's legislative boundaries in 1929 had the important effect of incorporating the northern city of Khujand, renamed Leninabad in 1936, into the Tajik SSR. Khujand, having been part of the Emirate of Bukhara until 1920, was already a fairly developed city. Basically, it was the only developed city in the Tajik SSR, and therefore it was needed to provide a pool of well-educated elites who could form the backbone of the Tajik bureaucracy. Accordingly, investment poured in from Moscow, and by 1932, the share of industry in the Tajik SSR's economy had risen to 22% from just 6.6% in 1928. Still though, in Stalin's first 5-year plan, Tajikistan was deemed integral to cotton production, and so much of the Central Authority's efforts were concentrated on the Vakh River Valley. Rural populations were moved from their settlements in the mountains to the newly constructed kolkhozy, or collective farms, to work in the cotton industry, and in a move that was 100% true to form, the Soviets would divert the Vakh River for cotton irrigation in subsequent decades. Despite these moves, by the end of the Great Patriotic War in 1945, during which 260,000 Tajik citizens served in the Red Army, Tajikistan remained starkly underdeveloped compared to other republics, even in Central Asia. Tajikistan's mountainous territory made it almost impossible to grow anything at scale besides cotton, and it also lacked the natural resources which could have facilitated more widespread industrial development. But even in the face of these realities, Stalin's death in 1953, followed by Khrushchev's rise to power, brought with it a recalibration of Soviet foreign policy which hoped to showcase the benefits of communism as a path to modernity for developing non-aligned states. For example, in our video on the Uzbek cotton scandal, we explored how Nourzhanov positioned himself as a key interlocutor between the USSR and the Third World. But could Tajik leaders pull off the same thing? When an Indian delegation visited the Tajik SSR in January 1956, they were certainly hopeful. For instance, as part of the USSR's coverage of the trip, Tajik poet Mizro Tursunzoda wrote in the local party magazine Kommunist Tajikistan that along with all the peoples of the Soviet Union building socialism and moving now to the heights of communism, they understand their great responsibility to be pioneers in their relations to the peoples of the entire East, which is now waking from many centuries of confusion and rising towards freedom to battle for a happy life. Khrushchev's subsequent recognition of Tajikistan's potential as a textbook example of Soviet modernity catalyzed a flurry of investment into Tajikistan in the 1950s. As early as the 1930s, Soviet geologists and economists had recognized the opportunities for hydropower production in Tajikistan, but Stalin's purges and the war had gotten in the way. By the late 1950s, however, the Perepadnia Dam had been constructed, capable of generating 30 megawatts of electricity. Another dam, Golovnaya, was opened with a capacity of 240 megawatts in 1962. This not only sped up Tajikistan's electrification, but also gave it something concrete and useful to export to neighboring republics. Most notably, construction of the Nurek Dam in the Vakhsh River Valley began in 1961 and was completed in 1980 with a staggering generation capacity of 3,015 megawatts. Beyond dams, the Soviets also started investing more heavily in Tajik cultural life in a belated attempt to create a wider Tajik intelligentsia and boost national affiliation. The Tajik capital Dushanbe, renamed Stalinabad between 1929 and 1961, got its first university in 1948, and under Khrushchev, a growing number of Tajiks were granted scholarships to study at elite universities in both Moscow and Leningrad. Concurrently, Stalinabad became increasingly cosmopolitan as cultural institutions like theaters, art schools, and literary institutes were established. Still, renewed vigor in Tajikistan in the 1950s didn't necessarily mean that everything was rosy from that point onwards. In fact, to put it bluntly, the Soviets' modernizing efforts in the republic really just didn't work. Granted, Tajikistan grew cotton, had dams, and hosted a university in its capital, but what else could it claim? Industrialization had not arrived hand in hand with urbanization, so Moscow struggled to overcome the traditions that characterized rural life in the isolated regions of the Tajik SSR. Of course, the opening of the university and other cultural institutions in Stalinabad was intended to improve this, but few rural Tajiks attended, and most those who did were either alienated by newfound cosmopolitanism or heavily discouraged from breaking away from traditions due to cultural obligations to their families. Instead, the main beneficiaries of development were the already privileged populations of Leninabad in the north and Kulob in the south, who used these new opportunities to further solidify their hold over the upper echelons of the CPT, the Communist Party of Tajikistan. Of course, this only had the effect of alienating rural Tajiks even further. The result was a tendency for Tajiks to identify themselves by their region rather than as Tajik. However, we should point out that they still did consider themselves Soviet. In short, by the late 1950s, the gap between urban and rural Tajiks was only growing, and so too was the regionalization of Tajik politics. Thus, when a letter arrived at Communist Party headquarters in Moscow in 1966, sent by a group of 8 disgruntled Tajik Party bosses complaining about localism, it was a surprise to no one. Okay, so one related element of Tajik society we have not yet explored is Islam. As elsewhere in the USSR, and as discussed in our episode on Soviet approaches to religion, during the interwar period, authorities cracked down on religion ruthlessly, leading to the arrest, exile, or murder of around 140,000 Muslim clergy members from 1917 to 1939 across the empire. In the early 1940s, though, Stalin adopted a slightly more relaxed stance towards religion. The Spiritual Muslim Board of Central Asia, or SADUM, was established in 1943, and according to historian Hélène Thibault, It aimed to, quote, regulate and control the religious situation, to strengthen the sense of unity, and to promote closer contacts between clergy and ordinary believers, especially in the absence of contacts with Muslims from abroad. Under Khrushchev, attendees of an all-union conference on the Council for the Affairs of Religious Cult in 1957 were similarly instructed to distinguish between the clergy, whom they called parasites seeking to use religion for their own personal enrichment, and ordinary believers. These developments reflected the Soviets' belief in the 1950s that their modernizing project, with its emphasis on scientific and technological progress, could overcome the supposed backwardness of religion without widespread suppression. As we shall see, however, the Soviets could not make Islam in Tajikistan disappear completely, given the stubborn, deep-rootedness of its traditions. In any case, the main feature that distinguished Tajikistan from other Soviet republics in the 60s, 70s, and 80s was its chronic economic inefficiency. Moscow, of course, continued to invest in Tajikistan throughout this period, but even at their peak, returns on capital in the republic were 10% below the USSR's average. Things were so bad that by 1985, 15% of all industries and 31% of all collective and state-owned firms, which in theory were the activities Tajikistan was supposed to be good at, were loss-making. In addition, just like Uzbekistan's cotton monoculture had created a complete lack of self-sufficiency, so too had Tajikistan's. In 1988, Tajikistan exported 21% of its produce to other republics, and it imported 29% of everything it consumed from the wider USSR. These were the highest figures for both metrics in the entire Soviet Union. To further illustrate the point, by the time the USSR collapsed, over 80% of Tajikistan's rural population still lived in their place of birth. And keep in mind, we acknowledge fully that as long as the Soviet Union remained stable, this would have been fine. Autarky was never a goal for any of their republics, after all. But if that stability was disrupted, well, you know where this is going. Anyway, by all accounts, these statistics paint a pretty damning picture of the failure of the Soviets' modernizing project in the Tajik SSR. Communism had not managed to establish a successful agriculture or industrial base in the republic, nor had it been able to bring urban development to the rural masses. The failure to kickstart Tajikistan's economy following the Khrushchev era, of course, exacerbated the other problems we previously mentioned. Because young people were reluctant to go to the cities and study in universities, already in 1966, the Tajik SSR was short of around 32,000 specialists. The only solution Moscow could find was to employ either underqualified bureaucrats or to import people from other parts of the USSR, which was hardly a recipe for success. Amid the economic stagnation, regional divisions crystallized as local party bosses built up wide-reaching and informal patronage networks to maintain control and increase their share of whatever economic or personal opportunities they could find. There simply was not much to go around, so competition was fierce. Unsurprisingly, Brezhnev's stability of cadres doctrine, a genius idea that led to unprecedented corruption in the Uzbek SSR, also enabled corruption to flourish in Tajikistan. The Tajik SSR in fact had its own miniature version of the cotton scandal, in which party leaders fiddled with the fiber content of raw cotton, so much so that they reduced its percentage from 34.4% in 1962 to 18% in 1984. This provided them with an additional revenue of around 140 rubles per ton, and given that Tajikistan's annual cotton production sat at around 900,000 tons in the 1980s, powerful figures in cotton-producing regions became very rich indeed. This, of course, did little to mitigate the already considerable regional disparities in the Republic. As Kirill, Nourzhanov, and Christian Bleur summarize, quote, "The end result was the politicization of regional identities. Elites and those within their regional networks would benefit or suffer based on government appointments and bureaucratic decisions. For example, when a Kulobi held the post of Minister of the Interior, Kulobi Tajiks dominated the ranks of that ministry. The police force continued to be dominated by Kulobis throughout most of the 1980s. But when a Pamiri was appointed to that post during the late 1980s, ethnic Pamiris moved into the ministry and displaced Kulobis from their position, creating a pool of unemployed and presumably angry Kulobi former police officers." In the meantime, the weakness of the Soviet state, the failure of modernization, and the unignorable poverty of many parts of Tajikistan provided conditions in which Islam could flourish. The term parallel Islam is useful to understand what happened here. The term originates from Soviet sociologists, but was popularized in the West by Alexandre Benningsen and Chantal Lemercier-Calquejet in 1968. Effectively, it demarcates the official Islam that was tolerated in the Soviet period and managed by Sadum from the parallel Islam that operated underground. Early Islamists were largely based in Kurong Tepe province, with movements led by figures such as Said Abdullah Nouri. Nouri established an underground organization in 1973, which eventually constituted the foundations of the Islamic Revival Party, or IRP, a key player in the future Tajik Civil War. Though he was arrested in 1986 for distributing religious material, figures like Nouri clearly had an impact. In 1981, 21 underground Islamic schools were discovered in Tajikistan by Soviet authorities. While it is important to note that Islam was not prevalent everywhere in the Tajik SSR, far from it in fact, it does provide yet another example of how people opted to identify with pretty much anything other than their titular Tajik nationality well into the 70s and 80s. Nevertheless, the mess that was the Tajik SSR's political system sort of worked. Indeed, because the republic was so divided along regional and ethnic religions and economic lines, the only thing that really held it together was the Soviet label that sat above it all. Kirill Nourzhanov and Christian Bleur again provide a concise overview of how this worked in practice. In Tajikistan, perhaps more than anywhere in the USSR, the process of decision-making was concealed from public view. It was essentially crypto politics, concentrated largely within the limits of the CPT, Central Committee, and its apparatus. Under Brezhnev, the governing elite in Tajikistan transformed itself into a self-stabilizing oligarchy that could retain its status even without resorting to blatant coercion. Tajikistan then, while a failed republic from an economic standpoint, was at least stable. And then came Mikhail Gorbachev. When Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in 1985, he came with ideas. And one of his main ideas for Tajikistan was to shake things up. The way he sought to achieve this was by consigning Brezhnev's stability of cadres doctrine to the dustbin of history. He quickly moved to replace many of the leaders of the CPT with 78 non-Tajik trusted cadres instead. In other words, politicians from Moscow. The then leader of the Tajik SSR, Rahmon Nabiev, staunchly opposed this measure, but he was swiftly removed from his post in 1985. Already by 1986, every single oblast leader in Tajikistan had been replaced, along with over 80% of Rayon leaders. Moreover, by 1987, none of the Central Committee secretaries of the CPT who served in 1985 remained. In theory, this was a sensible idea. Gorbachev thought it might reduce corruption and encourage development. But the problem was that he had completely disrupted the delicate balance of informal regional networks that had kept Tajikistan going for so long, and in doing so, destroyed the republic's stability. Regional Tajik elites did not have to wait long, or even at all, to voice their dissatisfaction with Gorbachev amid his adoption of glasnost as a statewide policy in 1986. Perhaps inevitably, the geographic fragmentation of Tajik politics increased dramatically as regional bosses used their newfound freedom to organize themselves into groups that would soon become the major players in independent Tajikistan's nascent multi-party political system. The Socialist Party of Tajikistan, for example, was founded shortly after independence and represented the relatively privileged urban clans of Khujand and Kulob, who hoped to retain the level of power they had enjoyed as members of the CPT. The aforementioned Islamic Revival Party, led by the same Said Abdullah Nouri, appealed to citizens in Garm and Korong Tepe and advocated for the establishment of an Islamic Republic. Another, Lali Badakhshan, represented Pamiri interests and was rooted in Tajikistan's eastern Gorno-Badakhshan autonomous region. A party of liberal reformers even emerged in August 1990, when Mahmudruzi Iskandarov set up the Democratic Party of Tajikistan to represent the mostly Dushanbe-based intelligentsia. Clearly then, the line from Soviet-era regional factions to competing and largely incompatible political movements is an easy one to trace, and it was Gorbachev's glasnost which enabled this transition. Dissatisfaction in late Soviet Tajikistan was not just an elite pastime either. The economy had already been stagnant for decades, but the situation for ordinary Tajiks had become simply unbearable by the late 1980s. 1988, for example, 12.6% of the entire Soviet population lived below the poverty line. In Central Asia as a whole, the figure was 45%, already much higher than the rest of the USSR, but in Tajikistan alone, it was 58.6%. Just 3 years later, in 1991, the figure was a staggering 87.3%. By February 1990, the boulevards and squares of Dushanbe were teeming with protesters who demanded better living conditions and the fairer distribution of housing from their Soviet overlords. And the response from the center? Well, Moscow dispatched 5,000 soldiers to crush the unrest before opening fire on protesters on February 11th and February 12th, killing 25 people and injuring over 850 others. In doing so, the Soviet government completely lost any remaining moral authority it had in the Tajik SSR, leaving the state to collapse and the various regional factions that had emerged to fight for the scraps. When Tajikistan announced its independence from the USSR on September 9, 1991, it therefore found itself in a state of complete limbo. How far were Tajikistan's regional leaders willing to go to cling onto their power? Well, early post-independence developments suggested that war was not necessarily a foregone conclusion. Indeed, Tajik elites recognized that the best way to forge a path forward would be to hold a free, democratic election for the position of president. In doing so, Tajikistan became the first post-Soviet state to make such a move, and this certainly set it apart from its Central Asian neighbors, most of whom quickly succumbed to authoritarianism. Think Islam Karimov in Uzbekistan, Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, or Supermurat Niyazov in Turkmenistan, for example. So why was Tajikistan different? Well, though there were liberal reformers in post-independence Tajikistan, the impetus was more that no single faction, not even the powerful Khojandis or Kulobis, was really in a position to establish meaningful control beyond their own region at this stage. With no powerful figure from the existing Soviet elite who could simply seize power then, an election was arguably the only choice. Anyway, for better or worse, the prospect of an election forced many of the regional factions to start working together. There were 20 candidates in September, and by election day on the 24th of November, there were only 8 as different factions had merged together. The election result itself, however, ultimately highlighted the emergence of a two-horse race between Rakhman Nabiev, the Khojandi former first secretary of the Communist Party of Tajikistan, whom Gorbachev had fired in 1985, and Davlat Kundorozov, a native Pamiri and the former People's Deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR in Tajikistan. Nabiev, on the one hand, represented the traditional Communist Party elite. Kundozorov, on the other hand, obviously represented the Pamiris in his home region, but he had also allied himself with the Garmis, the liberal democratic reformers of Dushanbe, and most significantly, Said Abdullah Nouri's Islamic Renaissance Party to form an opposition bloc. In the end, Nabiev won 60.44% of the popular vote, and Kundorozov won 31.4%. The opposition accepted the result, albeit through gritted teeth, and Nabiev was inaugurated as the president of Tajikistan on December 2, 1991. So, Tajikistan had a leader, but how would Nabiev face the long-standing divisions in Tajik society? To find out, tune in to our next episode. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which has made the decision to remain on its ancestral village somewhere to the south of Piki Komunism. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.